Hey, welcome back, and this next episode of Mapping the Shadow. This episode is all about projection, this term you hear thrown around rather a lot in shadow work practice and teaching, and follows on nicely from the last episode, which was on empathy. Largely because, well, empathy is a word you hardly ever hear in the context of shadow work, and is actually the most important subject or concept to understand in the understanding of shadow work. On the contrary, the word projection is used almost synonymously with shadow and shadow work. So it's really important we understand what is it that we're talking about here? What is it that folks refer to when they talk about projection? And what is it from a psychospiritual perspective? What is it at its essence? We're going to be digging away at that, trying to understand it. And furthermore, that actually, is there really a difference between the two? If I experience someone else as behaving a certain way, rightly or wrongly, or accurately or inaccurately, is that a form of projection? Is it a form of empathy? Given in the last episode, I defined empathy as the willingness to meet and be transformed by experience. If I experience someone acting a certain way and it may or may not reflect something in me that's active or dormant or some capacity to behave in the very same way, then I'm meeting with experience. I may be denying it, and there's a key distinction there. There's many distinctions with projection that we really need to unpack, delineate. But at their essence, is there really much of a difference between projection and empathy? Because both would appear to be understanding the world in terms of ourselves, right? In some way. And what that difference is, we need to examine a little more closely. But of course, projection is often thought of as one of the main routes into understanding the shadow. Like what we see in the world, if we're always seeing people who behave in a particular kind of way, if we have a pattern of seeing arrogance in the world, it's just our own projection, right? If we have a pattern of seeing unkindness, well, it's because actually there's some part of us that wants to be unkind or is unkind. Let's take it to its extreme. You're just seeing that because you're being unkind. Right, well, of course, one of the main aims of the shadow map model is to try and unpack some of this, because nuance matters, and the very underpinning philosophy of Jungian psychology, shadow work, even though Jung wasn't a fan of the idealists, at least overtly, the mechanics of Jungian psychology are based on similar premises. And one of those is that there's truth and falsity to everything we claim, everything we experience. But truth in itself comes from that dance. It comes from reconciling with both sides. I talked about this recently in the context of rational thought and materialism versus intuition, imagination, and so-called irrational thought. Both might claim to have a kind of truth, but true truth comes from the blending of the two. That applies to whatever dialectic we want to look at. Whether we want to look at, say, the cognitive function of introverted thinking. You can think of this as like the sage archetype, perhaps. It's all about understanding truth, right? Understanding what is right, what makes sense. But unless it accounts for feeling of some kind, then it cannot claim to be complete truth. It can only be partial, because feeling is true. It's contained within truth. So everything is partial and everything is dual. And there's an energetic exchange that must occur. So then, when we're talking about projection, we need to understand how it works. The idea of projection itself can itself be used in a way that embodies its very own ostensible workings. So I've thought long and hard about this, because whenever we're talking about projection, or we're talking about the way the mind renders our experience through whatever means that is, for me, it just raised many, many more questions. Like, what is the actual mechanism here? Why is it happening this way? And at a fundamental level, because I think there's many mechanisms to it, but you can think of it as unified under a single mechanism. And that is that the mind necessarily must render experience through existing energetic pathways, whether that be Kant's categories or archetypes. There's different ways of thinking about the structure of the mind and the way in which it can therefore render its experience. But then it's also based on recent memory, personal distant memory, what's dormant, what's repressed, ancestral memory, the collective unconscious. There's all these different facets to it, but it all comes under this model. And therefore, if it's only rendering through what it knows necessarily, then it must externalize what cannot yet be contained internally, and then render those things in terms of itself, in its particular self. And therefore, what we might call projection as a sort of outright defense mechanism is just one subset of this entire process of mind, of empathy more widely, yes, but also the very experience of the world. Right? It's all subject to the same process. So what we call projection is just one part of that. And we ought to use the word very carefully, because unless we have a very nuanced understanding of all these different ways in which so-called projection can unfold, firstly, we don't know which kind we're talking about. But secondly, we don't necessarily know the reason or the motivation for it occurring that way. And thirdly, we don't necessarily know the truth of it. You know, are we not entitled to actually make assessments about the world? You see, the idea that everything's a projection, not only is it itself a projection, as I've already explained, and if we hold that as a view, we're going to assign it to everything, to yourself, to your clients, and it may be useful to an extent, but not absolutely. So it itself is a projection. But there's another problem here, because, again, look for the irony, because where there's irony, there's insight. And the irony here, of course, is that if you take that idea to its extreme, you're kind of saying two things. You're saying, on one hand, that the person who is projecting has no way to make any assessment whatsoever about the truth of what they're seeing. Like, it's just, they're just seeing themselves and nothing else matters, and they have no right or ability to say anything about what they're experiencing in the world. It doesn't sound very conducive to individuation, right? Because the idea of individuation is to become undivided in yourself, and therefore to have a better grasp of truth, the truth of your own realization, but also of what you're actually seeing in the world and making sense of the world. So clearly, if you're not able to make some assessment about what you're seeing, that's not individuation. That's the opposite of individuation. The second irony there is that it contradicts itself, because it says that, okay, you're not able to tell the truth, but I am, and I'm able to tell the truth about you using the very same process that I critique in you implicitly. So it completely breaks down, because it's like saying, yeah, everything you see is just a projection, but everything I see, that's true, that's correct. So this is the opposite of self-knowledge. This is dissonance and self-contradiction, and it breaks down at the edges. Doesn't mean it's not a useful idea. It's an idea to hang out with for a time. But like every idea, it can be both a vehicle and a trap. And at some point, not only will be misleading, but will be actively used to distract, to enslave, and to misdirect you. So that's why knowledge is power, and that's why a very nuanced understanding of this whole process of mind is really important here. It's tricky, but when you see that there is a contradiction here, well, do you not feel compelled to understand it then more deeply? Because I certainly do, and it led me to this whole thought process around, well, what's actually going on at the level of the mind here? Jung himself, as he said many times, he was not a philosopher, did not regard himself as a philosopher. He likened himself more to like a surgeon, where his aim was to just solve the problem that was in front of him. And that's all good and well. But we cannot build a medical system around surgeons. We cannot build understanding purely around surgical psychology of just trying to fix a problem. And Jung himself was well aware of that. So let's understand it a bit more precisely then, like what's actually going on when we see something in the world and it represents a part of ourselves. And furthermore, is this a defense mechanism? You know, is it just because this is something that we're doing that we reject or repress? Possibly. That is a very real, not only possibility, but inevitability at some point. And that inevitability is important because it means that it's not necessarily done in an evil way, in a vindictive way, but it also can be. And there is all the difference in the world. So then, 3 reasons why we might be perceiving something in the world in terms of ourselves in this particular way. Well, the first thing is that there's this directedness of mind that Jung referred to. This is that ignorance on one hand and the selective perception on the other. So we perceive through our mental structures, and whatever doesn't fit that must be ruled out. So we may have some pretty strong understanding of what, let's say, arrogance or unkindness means. There could be all kinds of reasons for that. It doesn't necessarily mean it's because that's something we're doing ourselves, but it can. Either way, we're seeing in terms of what we know, and what we know can naturally manifest both internally and externally. But that doesn't say much about whether the thing is conscious or unconscious. But it's nonetheless a really vital part of it. The second is what I've termed here energetic necessity. And this is, again, looking at the shadow map, this is something that must occur at some point, because everything must come back to the self, ultimately. We're not going to dive into why that is right now, but just understand in terms of polarity, this is just a useful rule for understanding how this works. It must come back to wholeness. And that means that if you become one-sided in any conceptual way, any energetic way, whether it's towards extreme logic or extreme feeling or extreme intuition or extreme sensation, or you want to be the world's best mother or the world's best father, the world's best accountant, whatever it is, there's going to be this energetic pull back in the other direction. This is what was termed enantiodromia, this idea that ideas at their extremes run to their opposite or become their opposite. And a reason for that is negation. It's this self-contradictory element. For example, the most efficient person in the world, they're so efficient that they actually become ruthless. But there's actually nothing efficient about ruthless. So there is and there isn't. It looks like efficiency. But as it becomes more ruthless rather than merely efficient, it actually ceases to become efficient. And so there becomes this differential between true efficiency, or the notion of efficiency, and its mere appearances in reality, which is ruthlessness. This is what Hegel termed negation, this gap between the two, where the reality, so-called, the actuality, no longer matches the underlying truth, essence of reality. And at first that's felt as a bit of a tension, and then it becomes kind of like more extreme and inhibiting, and eventually it becomes completely undeniable. And at that point, if we insist on denying the undeniable, it becomes self-destructive. It must force a change. So that's another reason why there can be this phenomena that we call projection, because you might yourself become a pushover of kinds, right? Through your desire for efficiency. You might be judging everyone else as a pushover, let's say. Let's just take that as a possibility, an example. But actually, what's going on is that you've become so efficient to the point of ruthlessness that actually you yourself might have become a kind of pushover. Because if all you care about is efficiency to the point of ruthlessness, don't you see how that's also kind of like being a pushover? Because you're allowing yourself to be pushed over by a singular value, that thing you must have or must want or must adhere to. And by the same token, there's a whole host of stuff that you're trying to avoid there. Like, as I've said here, in the antidote to ruthlessness, you have being considerate, right? And so you can trip yourself up or even be marked by others as someone who is so ruthless that actually they're a pushover in their ruthlessness. Want this person to do whatever you want them to do, just give them an opportunity to be ruthless and they'll do it. They'll have to, as a way to try to maintain their own self-image of ruthlessness. So that's kind of the same as being a pushover, right? So eventually this person, you, whoever, might be seeing everyone else as being a pushover, but actually it might be you that's actually being a pushover in some way. You might see them as being ruthless. Now that's another thing to understand here about the shadow map. Very important thing is that we don't only project what's in the shadow according to this map. Any aspect, any one of these 5 areas on the map, let's go to a basic one, whether it's the conscious thesis to an extent, because that is partial. So there'll be aspects of that missing. Whether it's the power position, the shadow position, the antidote, or the self itself, all of this can be projected in the way being described here. Every piece of it can be projected. Now, naturally, the shadow position might be projected a little more readily, or in certain ways that we associate more with projection. But of course, the self can be projected, whether it's the archetype of the self or some constituent of it. Any archetype, mother, father, sage, caregiver, explorer, these can all show up in various ways. It's the reason we enjoy film and stories, is because we recognize these aspects of the self in them and engage with them through the image in just the same way as we do through the power position and the conscious thesis. But what's interesting about this is that actually the power position can become projected. Again, if we go back to the example of efficiency here, the efficient person, the ruthless person, believes they're being efficient. They see their own ruthlessness as efficiency. Maybe they even do see their own ruthlessness, but more likely they're going to render that power position in terms of the self. They're going to regard the power position as just, well, this is how things work. This is how we do things, because remembering the directedness of mind here, the need for any principle or idea to pursue its own maximum development, to be rendered partial in particular. It's necessary, it's important. But that also means that the power position or even the shadow position can be confused for the self itself to an extent. It's always particular, but it also represents an aspect of the self. And the remaining pieces that are missing can get projected onto it. This is how we come to know the self. So that basically means that even in the case of efficiency and ruthlessness, the ruthlessness can be projected and manifest in the world. So even though you identify as efficient, you may be spilling over into ruthlessness, whether by sheer quantity or maybe even misdirection, misapplication of that same energy. And it's not hard to see why you might therefore encounter ruthlessness in the world, because on one level, you're kind of giving it the green light. Right? Through your own behavior, you're also seeing it in the world as not necessarily a problem, but also conditioning others to behave that way. It sort of normalizes that. And at the same time, you're then likely to encounter the negation of it as well. Like the need to double down on that thesis to become that power position serves a purpose of negation, serves the purpose of understanding the difference between the mere particulars and the image of it versus the reality that it purports to represent. So this is a really key point about how actually it's not only our shadow in terms of this map that we project per se, but it's also the power position. It's also the dark side of how we think we are, how we should show up. So if you don't know this going into shadow work, you can get very confused. You might confuse your persona for your shadow and vice versa. As I've illustrated here with a map of the persona and the dark persona versus the light shadow and the dark shadow, they're two different things, but they actually share something underneath. So even though everything on the right side of the screen is considered part of the conscious makeup, and everything on the left side of the screen is considered shadow, well, actually the dark shadow and the dark persona, they share something. They both share a distance and an alienation from the self, which is why they're dark in some sense, right? Even though the dark persona is conscious to an extent, like it thinks it's probably not dark, but actually it's that very darkness that might be considered shadow as part of the persona. So often when people talk about shadow, sometimes they're talking about what I would term the dark persona. It's that the thing you thought was good is actually bad. Okay, so I would certainly grant that. But that also opens up a whole other suite of questions and a whole other vast and very important area of study, and that is around evil and morality. And we're going to be getting to that because it's really important. The understanding of morality and evil is not only a natural point of doing shadow work, It's actually the logical endpoint. Because first we're understanding duality itself, then we're going to understand, well, there's these different flavors of how this duality shows up, whether it's kindness, whether it's sufficiency, whether it's some other symbol in my tarot birth chart, whether it's this Piscean sort of moon-like energy, whether it's something like fairness itself. It all has a duality. But therefore, how can we say which is good and which is bad, so to speak? Well, there's another layer of understanding there. And it's really vital that we not only regard projection as a one-sided concept, but that the understanding of morality itself supersedes it. Like, it has to progress to that point. And if we're just doubling down on the idea of projection as a way of doing shadow work, it leaves out so much. And most ironically, it actually opens the door to evil. Because, I don't know if you noticed, but one of the most common uses of the term projection is to accuse other people of projecting some kind of angle or some kind of usefulness in debates or arguments, often used very spuriously and very maliciously. So my plea to you here is that in understanding these concepts, use them wisely and use them with those wholesome intentions I talked about. Don't necessarily use them just to win arguments or to defend yourself against accusations. That would not be empathy to do that, right? That would be the opposite. That's like trying to defend the idea at any expense. But also be equally skeptical of when others accuse you of projection, because often it's actually not, because if it was for your benefit, then it would come contained with that willingness to transform in itself, right? It would come without that self-contradiction. The self-contradiction is you're just projecting as though it's serving some kind of higher purpose, when quite clearly and quite blatantly it often isn't. And so don't be afraid to call out irony, don't be afraid to call out self-contradiction, at least to yourself. Right. So then, I'm going to end this episode just talking about the various different kinds of projection that there are as I see it. Now, I'm going to share a model with you that I call the projection matrix. And as I've alluded to already this episode, there is not just one kind of projection. What is often judged as projection is seen as one particular kind. And that would be to unconsciously project unwholesome qualities. But any reading of Jung or Johnson or von Franz or James Hollis even, you quickly see that there are many, many examples of instances where projection is not only unwholesome qualities. And is there any reason to think that it isn't at least half the time? Is there any reason to think it's more than half the time, one way or the other? I don't think so. I think that we project wholesome qualities just as much as we project unwholesome qualities. But looking at a shadow map, for example, we project our antidote just as much as we project our shadow position. The very disciplined person might see flexibility in others just as much as they see unreliability. The mind might be seeking out, unconsciously maybe, like unreliability, because that appears as a threat to the structured persona. But by the same token, they're also going to be seeing flexibility. And they're also going to admire flexibility because it's precisely what their structure needs in order to not become rigid. So therefore, we don't only project unwholesome qualities, so-called. We also project wholesome qualities. But here's another thing to think about, is that we don't only really project unconscious qualities. Technically we do, for the reasons I've mentioned, for the mechanisms I've described on the previous slide, the directedness of mind, the energetic necessity, and the proximity to consciousness. Yes, I mean, there is this unconscious factor that's going on. But there's also conscious recognition. You might not call it projection, but in a sense it is, because you're still seeing it in terms of yourself. So in some sense, it's still a kind of projection, like in the sense that maybe Plato might have thought about it. You're still seeing the thing in terms of yourself, or your own, in principle, your own capacities or your own possibilities. Even if there's no chance of you becoming the world's next great dictator, and it's not about saying that you might go and do that. It's consciously recognizing that aspect of mind rather than denying it. And just like when we look up at the stars, right, and you see the zodiac sign of Pisces, maybe you recognize that you're seeing the shape of a fish in the sky. So there's both projection, but there's also the conscious recognition. So therefore, projection is not only relating to dark or unwholesome qualities, and it's not only relating to things that are unconscious, it can also be things that are conscious and known and recognized as well. So this effectively gives us 4 kinds of projection. That's hence the matrix. You've got light qualities, dark qualities, and you've got conscious recognition and unconscious projection. And when we usually talk about projection as a so-called defense mechanism, we're usually only talking about the last one, that is dark or unwholesome qualities being projected unconsciously. And that simply is not the entirety of projection. In fact, it doesn't stop there, because we've got our 4 kinds here, all of which are very relevant to shadow work. But do you see anything missing from this? Yeah, in fact, there's a very important thing missing from this, and that is the intention with which it's done. Because all 4 of these kinds of projection can be done with either wholesome intentions to actually discover more about the self, or with unwholesome intentions to deny that journey in its entirety, to violate the very freedom you need, using your freedom to do this work. So that is all the difference in the world, understanding that difference. And it's quite incredible that to this day, the best thinking we have on that whole phenomena and the mechanics of evil is from Friedrich Schelling. And his work was mostly written down about 200 years ago. And he's almost forgotten to much of the academic world of philosophy, and certainly to the world of psychology. And it's very concerning, to be honest, that for all this talk of shadow work, we still have no idea what we mean by evil and badness and goodness. So anyway, therefore, it actually gives us 2 matrices. You've got the same 4-point quadrant, but now divided into both wholesome and unwholesome intentions. So in other words, there are 3 dimensions through which projection can occur. Is it to do with light qualities or dark qualities? Is it unconscious projection or conscious recognition? And thirdly, is it done with empathy? Is it done or being done, consciously or not, with this overarching intention to move towards greater self-knowledge? Or is it done through the misuse of free will, malignant intentions to deny that whole process? So if you're listening on the podcast, hopefully you've got a sort of pretty workable image in your head now of how that might look. It's basically an 8-piece quadrant, and you might want to check out the YouTube video just for an image of it. But it basically means that every one of these possibilities has a certain way of showing up. So let's look at some of the more sort of less commonly understood ones. So for example, you might question how someone can project or recognize light qualities with malignant intentions. Well, that's quite simple. So the third box along, I'm going to try and point to it with my mouse now. Here is using malignant intentions to project or recognize light qualities consciously in another. So basically that I've described as projecting virtues, but with manipulative intentions. So it's not unknown, right? If someone maybe is very flattering towards you, giving you all these compliments, love bombing is a pretty clear example of that. They're seeing genuine virtues in you, and they're doing it with unwholesome intentions, right? And they're saying it and they're making it real and making it known to you, but it's done with the intention of getting commitment from you or being able to manipulate you later, or then being able to withdraw those strategically at a later date. So that's a kind of projection. It's a kind of seeing something in the other. And typically, if someone's doing that to you, it is also because they want that part of you. They want ideally to get that from you, download it in some way. And if that fails, to recruit you in some way in order to project that inner goodness onto them. So it's a form of theft. They're trying to steal that from you. So then let's look at another example. Let's move one down. So that can also be done unconsciously, and often is done unconsciously, right? So someone's seeing good qualities in another, in you, in whoever, doing it unconsciously, but also doing it with unwholesome intentions, this pervading desire to avoid the self. And so what that looks like is like trying to download the goodness of others. Because goodness doesn't just come. It's not like, we're born with a kind of goodness, but it's also something that has to be realized through this process or this dialectic of engaging with tension and empathy and working through pain and suffering. But pain and suffering is difficult by definition, right? So a lot of folks just don't want to go there. And the obvious, most expedient solution to that is to just try and like download it from someone else, just get it like buying a product off the shelf or something, just completely circumventing that whole empathic encounter that needs to occur. So let's choose one more then. So let's say that there's dark qualities in you that you're unconscious of. This is starting to sound like conventional projection, but you have wholesome intentions to bring that to light. So you're practicing empathy. Now, if this is happening, then I don't believe it can meaningfully be called a defense mechanism, because it's serving a teleological process or purpose. It's not trying to deny that thing. It may be not yet aware of it, and that can happen through repression, because it might have been that when that thing did occur, it wasn't the right time for whatever reason to bring that to light. And that's pretty understandable. That's like, say, for a 10-year-old kid, right, it's not the right time to be running a marathon or to be competing in Olympic sports. There are certain conditions that have to come into place first. And the mind works in exactly the same way. And there's a degree of mercy and understanding that's needed in light of that. Not everything has to be done right now. And if we want it to all happen right now, that's just another form of avoidance. That's just another area in which empathy is lacking. However, at the point in which it does become the time to realize those qualities, it may be getting projected. It may be something that's unwholesome. And that may be not because it's bad in itself, not because in the form of kindness, let's say that because there is a selfishness there in itself, but because there's actually also the ability for genuine self-care. And likewise, the power position would be selflessness, or even like falling in love with the image of kindness for self-aggrandizement, or to act humble or something like this. And so in that case, it's very possible that that person will see other people trying to be selfless and maybe feeling threatened by that, because that example of what they're trying to be creates negation when they see it. They think of themselves as very selfless, and they see someone else who acts kind of selfless or sees themselves as selfless, and it puts them face to face with their own falsity. It's just unavoidable. This is negation. So you can see how the power position might be projected. You can see how that might bring to light certain challenges, but also, let's go back to it, seeing selfishness around as well, because that too threatens their kindness, actually in precisely the same way. There's the enantiodromia between the selflessness and the selfishness, but it's also the way in which the person who sees themselves as very kind will see someone who they regard as selfish and realize actually it calls their own kindness into question. That's the key. It shows them the partiality of their own kindness. So they want to go around feeling like they're the kindest person in the world, but actually when met with negation by virtue of truth, right, by virtue of falling short of the truth of kindness, the true reality, that's going to be experienced as a tension. Nothing wrong with that. It's completely natural, completely normal. So that might be classed as this, what I've termed, not yet realizing the dark qualities in oneself. But if that person is bringing empathy to their experience, it's not a problem. They can just confront that tension. They can use it. They can work with it to build a deeper understanding of what kindness actually is. And I don't mean kindness in itself, but something more essential. You cannot put a name to it. It's just what they is. It's just who they are. So, nearing the end of this episode now, but again, just want to highlight that when you often hear about projection in a Jungian shadow work context, it can take you so far, right? It can be helpful to an extent. There is that phenomena, but there are so many exceptions to the rule that it no longer really becomes a rule anymore. And I've illustrated this on the matrices here. Again, just by circling that bottom right corner, what we call conventional defensive projection is often assumed to be unwholesome intentions. So dark qualities done or projected with unwholesome intentions and done so unconsciously. And this is problematic because, well, firstly, it's just one of 8 kinds of possible projection that I've laid out here. But secondly, because if you're truly defending and you're trying to avoid yourself, in other words, you have malignant intentions. You're not doing it because you haven't just yet realized it and you just want to take those and make the best of it and understand what it shows, what it's telling you about your own mind. No, you're doing everything you can to consciously avoid that process. Well, then why are we even talking about shadow work? Why are we even talking about self-knowledge? This is a person who's decided that they're never ever going to go there. So if anything, this whole right side of the table here is not for saying, okay, this is what to look out for in yourself and to try and work with, because you just have to choose whether you want to develop self-knowledge or not. You have free will to do that. You have the freedom to do that. I would encourage you to recognize that freedom and do what you will with it and use it for this purpose of coming back to, not just coming back to self, but full self-realization as an individual. But if you're not doing that, then there's no point in us talking about shadow work. If you are doing that, then where this matters is really important for you to understand what you encounter in the world. And so I think these matrices here can help you do that, help you make sense of what you're experiencing, not to help others, not to fix others, but to help yourself. Right. So with that said, I believe that's the end of that episode. So I will thank you for your time and attention, and I will see you in the next one, where we're going to be continuing our discussion of defense mechanisms. I'll see you then.